Okay, so today,
We're diving deep
a
into
prayer really that's both
intensely personal and well,
surprisingly universal. We're
yeah,
looking at Psalm 22,
it's a cry of anguish. Yeah, a glimpse into the heart of suffering.
and it bridges the gap between King David and, amazingly, Jesus himself.
That's right.
Now, this isn't your typical quiet prayer. Psalm 22 is raw emotion.
Yeah,
It's about feeling utterly abandoned, even by God,
right.
which is something I think a lot of us can relate to, even if we aren't particularly religious.
It's true. That sense of being completely alone, of crying out and feeling like no one hears you, it taps into a very human experience of doubt and despair.
To really get this,
Uh,
we need to go back to the source. We're talking King David, right?
we are.
But not the triumphant king we often hear about.
Yeah.
Here, he's in deep trouble,
Lord.
hunted by King Saul,
Oh.
betrayed, completely isolated.
Yeah, completely.
And you can just feel that desperation in every word of this psalm.
Absolutely.
Wow.
Take verses 1 through 11, for example. David isn't just complaining here. This is a desperate cry from someone who believes in God, but in this moment of intense suffering, can't sense his presence at all.
Wow.
It's a profound disconnect that I think a lot of people can relate to.
He holds nothing back, does he?
He doesn't, and the imagery he uses, it's incredibly vivid. He describes himself as a worm, not even a man,
Wow.
utterly scorned and humiliated. It paints a picture of someone feeling completely insignificant, crushed by what they're going through.
You know, it's interesting because even if we haven't lived through what David experienced,
Sure.
I think we've all had those moments when we felt small, insignificant,
Right.
like the weight of the world is on us. It can be incredibly isolating.
It can be.
But here's where things get really fascinating. While this psalm is intensely personal,
Okay.
it also seems to point towards something much larger, something that connects it to Jesus.
You're right. There's a growing consensus among scholars that the intensity of the suffering described in Psalm 22 goes beyond anything historically known about David's life. It's as if he's tapping into a depth of suffering that transcends his own personal experience.
So it's almost like he's anticipating a future event.
That's the idea. And the link to Jesus becomes even clearer when we look at Psalm 22.1,
Okay.
where David cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" These are the exact words Jesus cries out on the cross.
Wow. So we have this direct connection, this echoing cry of abandonment that ties this 3,000-year-old prayer
Yeah.
to this pivotal moment in Christian history.
Exactly. And it goes even deeper than that. Throughout Psalm 22, you see imagery that foreshadows the crucifixion, the mockery, the physical pain, that utter despair of feeling deserted.
The connections between David's words and Jesus' experience are profound.
They are.
It invites us to consider the timeless nature of faith and suffering.
What's so powerful about that connection is that it suggests that even Jesus, the Son of God, understood what it meant to feel utterly alone, abandoned even by God the Father.
And that brings up a big question.
It does.
If even Jesus experienced that depth of suffering,
Right.
why is it so hard for us to talk about, let alone pray about, those feelings of doubt and despair?
That's such an important question, and I think it's one of the reasons why Psalm 22 still resonates so deeply with people of faith today. It gives us permission to be honest with God, to bring our rawest emotions to Him without pretense.
So it's not about pretending everything is okay,
Right.
but rather acknowledging the struggle.
Exactly. Psalm 22 teaches us that honesty, even when it's messy, is a form of worship. It's about acknowledging our humanness before God who already knows our hearts.
And that's such a powerful message.
It is.
Because it tells us we're not alone in those dark places.
You're right. And it's through that acknowledgement of our shared human experience, our capacity for both profound suffering and unwavering faith, that we can begin to understand the true power of Psalm 22.
You know, it's one thing to read about David's anguish in Psalm 22,
Right.
but it's quite another to realize that his words were echoed by Jesus himself centuries later.
It's true.
That connection adds such a profound layer of meaning to this prayer.
It really does. And it raises the question, if even Jesus in his humanity cried out in despair, why do we hesitate to bring those same feelings to God?
I think there's often this pressure,
Right.
especially within faith communities, to have it all together, to act like we have all the answers.
Yeah.
But Psalm 22 reminds us that it's okay to not be okay.
It's more than okay. It's essential because it's in those moments of raw honesty when we stop pretending and allow ourselves to be vulnerable before God that true spiritual growth can occur.
So it's about leaning into those difficult emotions, those doubts and fears, instead of trying to suppress them.
Absolutely. Psalm 22 isn't just a prayer of lament. It's a blueprint for authentic faith. It teaches us that we can come to God with the full spectrum of human emotions, joy, sorrow, anger, doubt, and that he can handle it.
I've always found it interesting that even though Psalm 22 was written thousands of years ago in a completely different cultural context,
Right.
it still feels so incredibly relevant to what people are going through today.
That's the power of the Psalms, wouldn't you say?
Yeah?
They capture these fundamental human emotions in a way that transcends time and culture.
They give voice to those feelings we all have, but sometimes struggle to articulate. Like when we feel betrayed, isolated, unjustly treated themes that echo throughout Psalm 22 and unfortunately still resonate throughout human history.
Precisely. And it's not just about individual suffering either.
Right.
Psalm 22 also speaks to the collective pain of humanity, the brokenness of the world, and the longing for justice and redemption.
It acknowledges that life can be incredibly difficult and painful,
It is.
but it doesn't leave us there in that darkness, does it?
No, it doesn't. And this is a crucial point. While Psalm 22 begins as a lament, a pouring out of deep sorrow, it gradually transitions into a statement of hope. It's subtle, but it's there.
You start to see this glimmer of hope,
Yeah.
this trust that God is still present, even in the midst of suffering.
Exactly. And that's why it's important to understand that the word lament in the context of the Psalms doesn't simply mean to express sorrow or complaint.
Right.
A lament is also a form of prayer, a way of engaging with God from a place of deep need and dependence.
So even in our darkest moments, when we cry out in despair, we're still engaging in a form of prayer.
Yes.
We're still reaching out to God.
Yes. And that act of reaching out, of acknowledging our need for him, is itself an act of faith.
That changes how I see those moments when I feel most alone.
Right.
It's not about pretending I don't have doubts or fears.
Yeah.
It's about bringing those feelings to God honestly and trusting that he's big enough to handle them.
That's exactly it. And, the fact that the Psalms include these raw, honest laments alongside hymns of praise tells us that both are essential aspects of a vibrant faith. We're not meant to have it all figured out. We're meant to wrestle, to question, to seek, and to trust that even when we can't see it, God is still working.
It's like Psalm 22 gives us permission to be our true selves with God.
Yes.
Even the messy parts, and maybe especially the messy parts.
It does. And that's such a liberating message because it frees us from the pressure of having to pretend.
Right.
It allows us to come to God just as we are, broken, hurting, and in desperate need of his grace.
So how do we apply this to our lives?
If we're going through a difficult time, feeling overwhelmed by doubt or despair, how can we tap into the power of Psalm 22?
That's a great question.
It's one thing to intellectually grasp the idea of bringing our rawest emotions to God,
Right.
but it's another thing entirely to actually do it. Where do we even begin?
You're absolutely right.
It's not always easy, but I think Psalm 22 offers us a framework for that kind of authentic prayer.
What do you mean by a framework?
Well, if you look at the structure of Psalm 22, it begins in a place of utter despair, with David crying out to God from the depths of his suffering.
Right.
But as the psalm progresses, there's a subtle shift. David begins to recall God's faithfulness in the past, his deliverance from previous trials. And that remembrance seems to fuel a glimmer of hope.
So even in the midst of his pain, David chooses to remember who God is.
Yes.
And that changes something for him.
Exactly. And that's something we can apply to our own lives. When we're overwhelmed by doubt, fear, or suffering, we can look back at our own lives and remember those times when God has been faithful, when he's seen us through difficult seasons.
That's so powerful.
It's like we can draw strength from remembering that even though we might feel alone in this moment, God has never abandoned us before.
Right. And in those moments of remembering, we might find that our cries of despair gradually transform into prayers of hope.
Wow.
Even if that hope feels fragile at first.
And isn't that where faith comes in?
Absolutely.
That willingness to trust, even when we can't see the way forward?
Absolutely. And Psalm 22 also reminds us that we don't have to have it all figured out.
Right.
It's okay to come to God with questions, with doubts, with anger even. He can handle it.
So often we try to package our prayers in neat little boxes.
Right.
But Psalm 22 gives us permission to come undone, to be real, to say, God, I'm struggling. I don't understand this. I need your help.
That's the raw honesty that I think God longs to hear from us.
Psalm 22 is such a powerful reminder that no matter how alone we might feel in our suffering, we serve a God who understands our pain intimately.
Yes.
He entered into that pain himself, and he promises to never leave our side.
And it's that promise, that assurance of God's unwavering presence that ultimately gives us hope, even in the face of unimaginable suffering.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today, exploring the depths of Psalm 22, from its raw depiction of suffering to its message of hope and enduring relevance for us today.
Well, yeah.
It's a reminder that even in our darkest moments, we're not alone, and that bringing our honest selves to God is itself an act of worship. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Psalm 22.
It's been a pleasure.
We hope you'll continue to explore this incredible prayer and discover how its timeless message speaks to your own life.
We'll see you next time.